Hey everybody. This video is going to provide the follow-up discussion for the week 8 discussion prompt. So, if you remember last week in week 8, the image that you were asked to look at was a poster from like the 60s and 70s, and it featured 3 young girls on a couch, and the couch is sitting on a rug. You've got some musical instruments and a painting on the wall behind them. And then also above their heads is the text that says, "Girls say yes to boys who say no." And then at the very bottom, you see the words, "Proceeds from the sale of this poster go to the draft resistance." I think I also mentioned in the homework video from last week that the girl sitting on the couch, the one that's on the far left, is Joan Baez, who was a very, very popular singer during this time and very much known for being against the Vietnam War. The 2 other girls on the couch are actually her sisters. So, taking all of that into account, anything that you might know about that time period, we're going to try to figure out what this poster is saying, what it's all about. And if you struggled with the questions, that's okay. Honestly, it's almost like you have to go about this, maybe not backwards necessarily, but certainly a little bit of a different approach than what we've had to use for the other images that we've analyzed in the discussions. This one is not as easy to figure out right away. So I'm going to walk you through kind of putting the pieces all together in the poster so that then you can understand how to answer the questions. And again, it's okay if you struggled with it. The ads were pretty easy in the beginning. Then we moved into the Declaration of Independence, and then I Have a Dream, and now we are on this one, which is considerably trickier than the others that we've looked at. And just as a warning, the one for this week, the week 9 discussion, if you haven't looked at that already, it's a bit of a doozy as well. But that's okay. I hope you guys have at least somewhat enjoyed trying to figure all this stuff out. But for this particular poster, let's think about the context of it first, okay? So we know that, we're in the Vietnam War era. We know that mostly because it's Joan Baez. And if you don't know that's her, then that makes it a little trickier to figure out when this poster is, the context of it, which part of history it's coming from. But then you do have the words at the bottom, "Proceeds from the sale of this poster go to the draft resistance." And if you know anything about America's war history, then you know that the draft during the Vietnam War was a huge deal. And it was, man, if you see any kind of archived footage, or even in like TV and movies where they're recreating life during this time, and if you see young men, and often surrounded by their family, watching the television, and their number gets drawn for the draft, it's just heartbreaking in a lot of cases, because the further we got into that war, the more Americans were pretty much convinced that if you went over there, you weren't coming back home, because so many people were dying, so many men were dying. Now, if you could put that together and think about the draft resistance, what is the draft? It's having your number called to join the military, whether you want to or not. So that might have helped you place this poster in that era. Okay, so it is happening during the Vietnam War, and the draft is a very big deal. America was very much split during this time. There were a lot of Americans who fully supported the war in Vietnam and our involvement in it. And then there were equally an equal number of Americans who were very much against it, who maybe, in the beginning thought that we were trying to do a good thing, but as time went on and it became clearer and clearer that maybe it wasn't worth losing so many of our soldiers because it just kept dragging on, more and more Americans started to turn against the war. And having your number called for the draft, again, obviously was a very big deal. And during this time, if your number got called, again, you had to go whether you wanted to or not. A lot of young men would try to get out of it. One very popular thing was to go out of country. So, a good number of young men fleeing to Canada to avoid the draft. A lot of them coming up with very bizarre medical reasons for not being able to go. And then there were some that just flat out refused. And the penalty for that, and if you got caught fleeing as well, the penalty was jail time. I can't tell you exactly how long. I need to research that again. I once knew, but I cannot remember. But there was jail time involved if you resisted. So this poster, it says at the bottom, proceeds from the sale of this poster go to the draft resistance. So this poster is helping fund an organization that is promoting young men whose numbers get called to resist the draft, to refuse to go. Think about that. They are publicly encouraging young men to resist the draft if their number gets called. These three young ladies, Joan Baez being one of them, are on this poster encouraging young men to resist the draft. Okay, so that's a little bit of our context here. They're using a celebrity, a very popular, very attractive, she was a bit of a sex symbol, using her and her sisters to promote this organization, this cause, the draft resistance. So let's go back and look at the words at the top. Girls say yes to boys who say no. The fact that we have Joan Baez on the poster and the fact that she was a very popular, very attractive, very much sought after celebrity adds to, I think, perhaps our initial instinct to think that when we're talking about girls say yes, that we're talking about sex, right? Girls say yes to boys who say no. So girls are saying yes to sex to boys who say no to the draft, right? So if you're a young man and your number gets called, if you resist the draft, then you'll have girls willing to have sex with you. I think that's a fair interpretation of it at first glance. But I think there's more to it than that. So, if a boy says no to the draft, again, what's going to happen? He's going to go to jail. Well, there are such things as conjugal visits, but I believe you have, I don't know, maybe you don't have to be married, but I'm not sure a bunch of random girls could come visit you in jail and have sex with you. I don't know. So that kind of makes you question whether or not girls are saying yes to sex with boys who say no to the draft. But I think there's even more evidence to suggest that it's not about sex. And that is actually the three girls on the couch. And yes, Joan Baez is, like I said, very much a popular singer during this time, bit of a sex symbol. Um, so it would be easy to assume that she is selling sex. But if you look closely at her and her sisters, they don't appear overtly sexual, do they? I mean, they're sitting very prim and proper. Um, they're not dressed especially provocatively. And keep in mind what was, fashionable during that time. But even look at their facial expressions. I mean, the one farthest right maybe has a little hint of a smile, maybe. But for the most part, I don't think they even look happy. They look very serious, very somber. So that kind of contradicts this very uh, flirty wording at the top. Girls say yes. Well, these girls don't look like they're about to say yes to anything. Certainly not anything sexual, right? Um, so that kind of leaves you wondering, okay, well then what the heck is this saying? Girls say yes to boys who say no. Okay, we get the boys who say no part. They're saying no to the war. They're saying no to the draft. Um, but what are girls saying yes to then? Because it's the more we look at it, the more it's starting to seem like maybe it's not a sexual thing. What could it be then? Well, there could be several possibilities. I think there's two um, very acceptable explanations for it. Um, what else? What other scenario do girls say yes to a boy? Um, Perhaps just a regular date, but I'm thinking more like marriage. So girls will say yes to marriage, to a future, to boys who say no. So it's almost like if you resist the draft, you become a more attractive potential partner to these females. I mean, on the one hand, that's because so many young men were dying over in that war. Your chances of keeping a partner, boyfriend or spouse, who went to war weren't great. So if you wanted a future with a woman, then you would have to say no to the draft. You'd have to resist. So perhaps it's girls say yes to marriage, to a future, to boys who say no. That might not be enough to entice young men to resist the draft and risk jail time, though. So maybe it's not that. Maybe it's simply girls say yes, as in, we got you, we support you, we're here for you. Girls say yes to boys who say no. I'm not sure which one is more correct, um, but I think using Joan Baez and her sisters kind of adds to the appeal of it, um, makes it more likely for young men to pay attention and think girls say yes to boys who say no. And even if they think it's sexual at first, if it gets the job done in the end and they don't have to go, and they don't go to war and we've saved their life by keeping them here, even if it's in jail for a little while, then maybe that's okay that they think it's a sexual thing at first. So that's interesting, I think. But you have to kind of work through all of that in order to answer the discussion questions. So of course the first question is, what is the issue being presented in the argument? And the issue is the draft resistance, resisting the draft for the Vietnam War. How would you state the claim or the thesis that's being communicated? You could simply go with the writing at the top, text at the top, girls say yes to boys who say no. I think if you really want a good claim, though, you have to at least clarify part of that. Even if you don't clarify the first part, because we're still not entirely sure what girls are saying yes to, but we know what boys are saying no to. So girls say yes to boys who say no to the draft, to boys who resist the draft. I think that that's at the core what it's saying. And really, I guess you could even make it simpler than that. And the claim is young men who want a future should resist the draft, whether that's a future in marriage or a future with sex or both. You know, young men should say no to the draft. Who is the intended audience? Well, clearly the primary audience are those men whose numbers are potentially getting called to go to the draft. Perhaps, it could be a secondary audience could be other women, like you should be supporting them as well, just like Joan Baez and her sisters are. I'm not sure that it would really include, I don't know if the audience would really include those who are fully in support of the war. I don't think that this is trying to change anybody's mind about the war. I think it's simply trying to urge young men to resist going if their number is called. Do you detect any assumptions in the argument? Does the arguer assume anything about the audience based on how the argument is presented? Keeping in mind when it was created and who that audience would have been. Obviously, they're assuming that we like Joan Baez, that we care about the fact that she's in the poster. They're assuming that young men want girls to say yes. They're assuming that we will know what the draft resistance is, right? What reasons and evidence are given to support the position? Well, okay, so ethos would be the fact that they're using Joan Baez in the poster. She's going to come with a certain level of credibility, maybe not to all Americans, but certainly to some. I think the way that they're pictured creates a certain kind of ethos as well, because they look so formal and serious. The logic that's being used, the logic would be, if you say no to the draft, girls will say yes. That's the logic. The pathos, I mean, if you're thinking that it's implying something sexual, then that's definitely appealing to pathos right there. But I think the good chunk of the pathos comes from just simply mentioning the draft. There's a lot of emotion attached to that whole era, anything involving the Vietnam War. So it's a very subtle combination of all three types of appeals. You've got the ethos, the logos, and the pathos. Not a ton of either one, just a little bit of each one. What makes the argument interesting and or effective? I think what makes it interesting is that it is kind of vague and that it isn't overdone. I'm not sure it was effective. I think it was probably effective in getting people's attention. I don't know if it was effective enough to actually get young guys to resist and not go off to war if their number got called. But I think it's effective in that it makes you think and it makes you wonder. And anything that involves a celebrity, especially a celebrity that's seen as a sex symbol, any kind of text that might imply something sexual in nature is going to be effective, at least on some level. This is one of my favorite posters to show to students because there is another level of complexity to it that we have not really seen in the other ads so far. I think, each week we've gotten a little more complex, but this one definitely kind of takes it up a notch. Uh, and I just think it's really cool how, on the one hand, it's very minimal in what it shows us, but yet the argument is very it is not minimal in the least. Um, so I'm very interested to see what you guys have to say in the follow up journal. Again, if you struggled with this one, it's it's okay. I really didn't warn you that it was going to be a lot harder, perhaps, than some of the other ones we've looked at. But anyway, I hope you at least got something out of it, even if it wasn't until hearing my follow up video. I hope you're able to see how there are different layers to this and how people might view it differently and how there might be different layers to it. There's that surface layer that makes us initially think that it's sexual in nature, and then some other subtle things going on underneath that might make us then question our initial reaction to it. But if you have any other questions or comments, you'll have a chance to express them in the follow-up journal. I cannot wait to read those. So otherwise, you guys are free to move on to the next item in the module.